Well,
Thank you so much for coming. We're very excited that you're here. And I wanted to just jump right in because I just feel like it's unusual to have an author who's also worked as an editor. And so you just, yeah. So my question about this book, and I think a lot of people, a lot of my students, they know that they have a topic that they're wanting to dive into. They know they have juicy stories, they have talent, but what's the book? How do you get from that you have the material to how I'm going to shape a book? Because a book needs certain things, right? So I wanted to start with, what did you know immediately about the shape of this book, and what did you struggle with?
so this book, I knew actually it changed enormously, and it actually
Okay.
changed thanks to the intervention of my fabulous publisher, Sunny Mehta.
Okay.
I don't know how many of you are familiar with Sunny. Very sadly, Sunny died while I was writing the book, but I had the joy of having as my publisher and also friend and hero for many, many years. And so just backing into a little bit of a story, one of the things that I had been told before I met Sunny the very first time was that he had very, very long pauses in his conversation, and that you mustn't talk over his pauses. And that's very hard for me because I
Yeah.
fill the time when there's a silence. I rush in. And they also said at the end of his pauses, he'll say one thing, he'll say it very softly, and he'll never say it again. So if you miss it, it's gone forever. So back to your question, Lizzie, I really wanted to write a book about my friend Maxie. Maxie's a friend, as people who've read the book knows, but he's also someone I admire tremendously. And he's someone who not only was not the person I really thought he was when I first met him 40 years ago, but he's also someone who grew and evolved and changed over time, and had a real journey, this journey from frat boy, jock, Navy SEAL to educator, empath, environmentalist, kind of yogi. And so I wrote up a proposal and sent it to Sunny, and Sunny and I went out to lunch with someone he worked as his co-editor, a marvelous guy named Dan Frank. And we had a big lunch, and we talked about this, that, and the other thing. We talked about everything. And at the end of the lunch, there was this epically long pause. Like, even for Sunny, this was a really, really, really long pause. And I was all I could do not to jump in, but I sat there. And at the end of the long pause, he said, I think the book you want to write is about your friendship.
Oh.
And I said, you're absolutely right. So the fact is, I knew I wanted to write about Maxie.
So you're saying it went from being kind of a biography to a memoir?
It went from being a biography to a memoir, but it also went, I then had to search for a structure that would accommodate that, because there isn't really a tradition of a story of a friendship, and this is important, where both friends live. There is a great tradition of, let me tell you about my dead friend. And so what does accommodate two characters who live? And on that, I was searching for a model, and I went back to Plutarch's Lives and the idea of a paired biographies, where he would do a Roman and a Greek and compare and contrast them in these paired biographies. So once I remembered Plutarch and went back and read Plutarch, I thought, I have my model.
All right. So I want to open it up to the students, my very talented writers. Who has a question for Will? Okay. Tess and then Emily. Okay.
Will, hi, and thank you so much for being here today. Well, I have a question about the book, but just very quickly, I wanted to check in and ask you if you're free diving yet.
No, definitely not yet. And
Okay.
I saw this horrific documentary about free diving, and I texted Maxie and I was like, I don't think this is going to happen.
Yeah, I watched some of those YouTube videos too, because I'm just kind of fascinated by the subject. I'm just in awe of people who do that. But my question, and it goes back along the lines of Lizzie's and coming to what you were going to write about. So when you knew that you wanted to write about this friendship, your friendship with Maxie, at what point did the subject of the secret society at Yale come into it? Like, did you know that that's where you were going to? I mean, it seems like a natural place to start it because it was where your friendship began. But yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Like, how did you know you wanted to work that into it? Because it's pretty prominent.
I love these questions. The first two questions, by the way, I'm so happy to get these questions because I love talking about structure. And I know that's a
It's
big
the
topic for
beast,
all of you.
right? It's the beast.
It's the beast. So even before my conversation with Sunny, I started out with this idea that Maxie should write a book. He didn't have time. That someone should write a book about Maxie. He was open to that, asked me who I could recommend. And this was an interesting moment. I lay awake all night just thinking, if someone else does this and not me, I'll be so jealous I won't be able to stand it. And I think for any story, the test is a little bit, if someone else were to tell this story and not you, would you lay up night after night thinking, damn it, like that I wanted to tell that story? And granted, with Memoir, some of the stories are yours, but there's certain, we could all tell all different kinds of stories from our life. So the very first thing I wrote was visiting Maxie in the hospital when he had his brain tumor. And that's where the book began. And for the longest time, that's where the book began. And I showed it, I show things to very, very few readers in advance, but there's one person I showed it to, and he said, I don't give a crap whether he lives or dies, and I really don't care about you either because I don't know him and I don't know you. So why would we care? Like, he's just some guy, you're just some guy. Said, like, introduce us to you. How did you meet, for example? And I was like, yeah. We got to go back to the start because otherwise, why would you care? And as soon as I went back to the start, I realized I intended just to brush past the secret society. And I then realized I had to go there. But as part of that, I felt I needed to talk to everybody I was in touch with from the secret society and get their permission, which I did.
I assume that helped you remember more details too.
Oh, yeah. The details. And at one point, very late, Singer, who you know from the book, was going through stuff. He said, like, I actually have a photograph from the weekend we all spent together. Do you want it? And that's the cover.
Oh, wow. Wow. That's very cool.
But I think, getting to the real nuts and bolts thing. Does everyone know a program called Scrivener? I use Scrivener. I don't know. I couldn't write without Scrivener at this point. And that's how I'm able to write entire scenes and sequences and then just send them shooting off in different places because it's just so easy to do.
Emily, what was your question?
Hi, Will.
Hi, Emily.
I've had a childhood best friend since I was 5, and I've thought about writing about friends. So your book really was really important to me. I was really surprised by the way you managed as a narrator to both tell us things about yourself, but also kind of to stay in the backdrop a little and let Maxie take the center stage. And I was really shocked by the way he just kind of swept like the ocean into the end of the book. And it was about him, but you were telling us about you the way you were telling us about him. And I just wondered if you saw that coming, or if that surprised you, or if I was interested in that part of the book.
Yeah, I mean, there was so much packed into that question, so I'll try to answer it coherently. One is, I did not realize I was an introvert until I wrote this book.
Oh,
I thought I was an extrovert. I always thought I was an extrovert. If someone asked me, what are you? I'm an extrovert. And I wrote the book and I got to the end of it and it's like, wow, I'm really an introvert. And these themes emerging of my just wanting to escape to my room with a book, and how much protective I needed to be of myself and my emotions. And I just didn't realize it till I wrote it. So Maxie is a genuine extrovert. That man does not need 1 second by himself ever. And so in that sense, of course, he was going to take over. I mean, he's very thoughtful and he's very considerate. And when we do events together, he is quiet and lets me talk, but in a social setting, it's the Maxie show, which I love. I love the Maxie show. So that was part of the truth of our relationship. But I had a really, a very odd experience when I did my first book event for this book. I walk into the bookstore and there's a bookseller, and I love talking to booksellers before events. And she said, I'm so happy to meet you. I've been dying to meet you. And I was like, oh my God, that's so nice. Why? And she said, well, because I really didn't like you when I read your book. And other people I know like you. So I just wanted to see for myself what was up. And at first I was a little taken aback. And then I thought, if you write a biography of a friendship and you're the more likable one, you've done something wrong.
Wow.
So I feel that almost the definition of a true friendship is feeling lucky to have the friendship of the other person. And if you think they're lucky to have your friendship, it's not really a very good friendship. And so it is Plutarch's Parallel Lives, but it's written by one of the lives. And in the end, I was really happy with that. I was happy that Maxie was the dominant character, that people wanted more of him, even than they got, and that they looked askance at me a little bit. Because to me, again, when I finished it, I gave it to this reader, and he said, wow, that was brave. And I thought, holy crap, I didn't mean to be brave. What do you mean it was brave? Uh-oh. Like I was, and then I thought, no, if someone says brave, that's good. So.
Well, thank you. I did love the part about your doubts and insecurities, because that helped me feel that while I was learning about Maxie, that I was identifying with those.
So yeah, I mean, I'm definitely what I've found, and I think I hope this is true for all of you in your writings, is really the highest compliment is a group of people who say, I feel seen, I feel heard. We are similar, and I didn't know there were people like me out there. And I definitely hear from people who are of the camp, you're a nut, I have no idea what that was all about. But definitely from the camp, people like, I didn't know people had the same fears and insecurities, that people went home after a night with friends and said, should I have said that? Shouldn't I have said that? Uh-oh, do I call them too much? Do I call them too little? So I feel like it's for us. It's not for everyone.
Thank you.
It's interesting what makes a reader connect to a narrator.
It is. It's also, I think one of the other things that none of this was purposeful, but I'm really thrilled how many people are engaging from the point of view of a book about men's friendship as being of a different timbre and character, not considering men as a fixed thing, but when I talk about men, I mean people who presented male at birth and were raised in stereotypically male ways, have a very different experience of friendship than people who presented female at birth and were raised in stereotypically female ways.
Lily, do you have a question?
Thanks, Lizzie. Hi, Will. Thank you for coming today. I really enjoyed your book. And it's funny that you were saying that the biographies you had read, or the stories that you had read, the other person always died, because I would say through the most of the book, I was waiting for Chris to die. So thank you for thank you for saying that, and thank you for writing this. A lot of the questions that I had have already been asked, but there were two things I wanted to say. Even though your life and my life are very different, I do relate to all the fears and insecurities you had, and that was my way in as I read your book. I guess my question is, when Sunny said, I think this is about your friendship, you had said that you had wanted to write this book about Chris and you wanted a biography, and I can see that you wanted to write about somebody else and not yourself. And when Sunny said that to you, did you think, oh shit, now I have to write all these very private things? And the more you went, the deeper you went. And what I loved was that how very deep you went, and that there were things that you told us that, as you were telling us, you said, I didn't tell anyone this except the secret society. And then I thought, well, now you're telling everybody. How difficult was that? How did you decide, well, if I'm in for a penny, I'm in for a pound?
So, and just before I answer that question, a slight story that might amuse you, which is I was already pondering this at the point when I visited Maxie in the hospital after his tumor. And I didn't put this in the book because it's too sort of meta. But in fact, one of the first things he said to me was, is it better for the book if I die? And I'm like, no, that's been done. That's a cliche. It's much better if you live. So why don't you pull through? Actually, what Sunny said was really interesting, and I've thought about it a lot. What he said was, I think the book you want to write is about your friendship. Not, I think the book you should write is about your friendship, or I think the book that you are writing is about your friendship. He was playing psychologist. And that's why I was instantly able to say, you're absolutely right. That's the one I want to write. But my challenge was that a biography of Maxie would have followed a very traditional route. Maybe with the thing, but once it became this other thing, a book about a friendship, a biography of a friendship is what I called it for the longest time. There was no traditional route. So one of the first rules I set for myself is, if I didn't tell something to Maxie, or Maxie didn't tell it to me, or it didn't happen when we were together, it couldn't be in. So that made for some really strange decisions, including the fact that we were out of touch for, years at a time, not for any reason, just fell out of touch. So for example, one reader wrote me and said, 9/11 is not in your book. You live in New York. You live blocks from the towers. If I were to pick up my laptop, I'd show you out the window how I had a full-on view. And it was like, it may sound strange, but we didn't talk about it. It can't go in. That was the rule. But the flip side of that rule was, if we did talk about it, it had to go in. Like, it's not fair to the reader to have one and not the other. So, to me, I'm very much of the school, and I tell the writers I work with the same thing. Put it down. You can always take it out, but put it down. Never censor yourself when writing. Write everything, even things you've never told anybody, you're not sure you ever want to tell anybody, things you're ashamed of, things that, just put it down and take it out later. But the funny thing about doing that is, when you read it, you're like, yeah, this happened. This was how I felt. I want this. I'm fine with this being out in the world. And to me, and this is a very important and powerful part of talking about memoirs for me, is people get really hung up on factual accuracy. So someone will say, oh, in that scene, you ordered, the steak au poivre at such and such a restaurant, but I looked on the menu, they don't have steak au poivre, gotcha. And to me, I fact check my memoirs like crazy. I fact check everything that can be fact checked. But to me, the most important thing is emotional accuracy, emotional truthfulness. And so I just feel it's a contract with the reader to tell the truth about how you are feeling and to give them enough context to know how you are feeling. And if you can't, and that's you, it's a memoir, not how someone, that's all on you. But I find when I read memoirs, I can tell when people are being emotionally inaccurate. And I think we all can. A classic example is when someone in a memoir says they were angry or offended by something, but their actions don't back that. And I think very often the emotionally truthful thing was, I was not angry in that moment. I was not offended, but I was when I thought back on it later, or I realized I should have been. And that's very different. And I always feel like I know I can tell. Not always, but I think I can tell a lot of the time. So in the end of the day, putting it out there, to me, actually, it's not, I don't believe in memoir as therapy. So it's not that it's therapeutic. It's just natural.
Leah, do you have a question?
Yeah, I had a connected question about that, which is there are times when I am, first of all, thank you. This is just so fascinating, so useful. But what I'm curious about is there are times, how do you deal with that thing of I realize now I should have been angry? So another way I will say it is there are times when I am going and I'm writing about something and I am learning and beginning to appreciate the complexity of the situation as I go to retell it. And I go, now, looking back on this, I see how, oh my God, I thought this person was being, I thought this person was being an asshole. Oh my God, this person was actually just, they were afraid. Oh my God, and I'm being the judgmental asshole. And I guess what I'm saying is like, I think there's a lot of things that are interesting there. And the more interesting thing might actually be is that then in that moment, not about laying on what I see now, but framing it in a way that maybe what I'm telling is actually the story from the first person about the revision. Does that make sense? Because that's the more interesting one than the original one I was going to tell, maybe.
It totally makes sense. And it actually allows me to talk about my single favorite book ever, which is, has anyone on the Zoom read Christopher and His Kind by Christopher Isherwood? So Isherwood, as many of you will know, was the British writer, kind of a spiritual descendant of E.M. Forster, who found himself in Berlin in the 1930s, wrote the Berlin stories that were made into Cabaret, the stage play, musical, etc. And moved to California, found love, got interested in Vedanta, continued to write novels, and really my hero. Gorbachev called him he was at the time living, the greatest living prose writer of our time. And he wrote a memoir called Christopher and His Kind. That's my favorite book. And is it pronounced Leah or how's it pronounced?
Leah.
So he was really grappling with exactly the question you asked. And he came up with a system where there are two voices in Christopher and His Kind. It's I and Christopher.
Ooh.
And I is the person writing the book. And Christopher is every other iteration of Christopher right up until the moment before that which is being written. And so in Christopher and His Kind, he'll have a passage where he'll say something like, Christopher then moved to Berlin. It was 1937, and Christopher believed that it was to see his friend W.H. Auden and study with the following great professor. But I know that Berlin meant boys for Christopher, and Christopher went there for the boys. And he does it throughout the book. Christopher does all these things. Christopher doesn't know his heart. Christopher doesn't know his mind. But I, looking back, have insight into Christopher that Christopher didn't have. Now, that having, given that Christopher did it, it would be kind of weird to do it again. But I try to remember that lens when I write. And there's a way of recreating that without the artificiality of the I in Christopher. So there's a way of saying there, Will sat there dumbfounded. He couldn't believe that Julie would say such a thing. But when he thought about it later, he realized that he had it all wrong. Or when I thought about it later, I realized that I had it all wrong. There is a way of truthfully saying what you were feeling in the moment, and then revising it. Now, I feel that I did a lot of that in this book. And this may be where some of the bravery comes in. Uncareful readers will review, people sometimes don't review memoirs, they review the life of the memoirist. It's incredibly annoying.
I agree.
So when they're reviewing their life choices, your life choices in the guise of reviewing your memoir, they will judge you on the unrevised self that you present and may not pick up on the revision you make to self later. But I think that's worth braving, because I think it is important to present what I would call the unrevised self in the moment, and then go back and explain it, fix it, understand it, present. But if you're looking for something to read, oh my God, Christopher and His Kind is so good.
Yeah, I'm gonna go put it on my queue at the library.
Fell in love with a young German man in Berlin, and who was going to be conscripted into the Nazis, and it's about them desperately fleeing all over Europe to try to find some place to take them before his boyfriend is forced to become a Nazi soldier. It's an incredible memoir.
Will, thank you so much for this conversation. I think you've blown all of our minds and given us a lot to chew on, and your warmth is really appreciated so dearly too. So please write more books, and then we'll have you come back and to talk again.
Great. And I will just end by saying, and Lizzie knows this about me, I'm will.schwalbe@gmail.com. I don't always answer emails promptly, but I always answer them. So if anybody has questions, wants to continue the conversation, just give me a shout.
Incredibly generous of you to share that. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Happy Labor Day.
Happy Labor Day.
Thanks, Will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing.
You on, right? So much to chew on. We are out of time. Thank you so much for your presence and participation. And I'll see you next week. Next week, Michelle Dowd. And hopefully you'll have very productive writing weeks and a wonderful Labor Day weekend.
Thanks.
Lindsay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.